My name is Tanya McGinnis. I'm the director of SAC. I'd like to thank all of you for attending tonight's webinar. This is our fourth webinar in the series, the Advanced Education series. And tonight, our presenter once again is Kevin Kiley with Grad School Roadmap, how to ace the admissions interview. So without further ado, I will hand things over to Kevin and we'll get started.
Awesome. Thank you, Tanya. Thank you so much for that introduction and for having me once again. And thank you all for joining us this evening. This is one of my favorite topics when it comes to graduate school admissions is the admissions interview and how to successfully navigate that entire process. And we'll get into a lot of details as the evening goes along here. But this is a really important topic. As Tanya and I were talking before we kind of went live here, and as I was saying to her, and as I say to nearly everyone that I coach when it comes to graduate school admissions and applications and the admissions process, you can be a phenomenal candidate on paper. You can be an ideal individual for a particular program. You could be a tremendous fit and everything. But for the programs that do conduct interviews, and so many of them do as part of the admissions process, if you don't do well in the admissions interview, you can suddenly go from being a wonderful candidate to a not so wonderful candidate, and by that I mean denied admission. So this literally can make or break your candidacy. So really important and topic here today. As Tanya mentioned, this is a webinar series that SAC is putting on all the way leading up to the Grad School Admissions Fair, which is next Wednesday evening, the 6th. And we'll have one final webinar before that on funding grad school. And we've had this whole series leading up to now, including the micro webinars that we did before the live series went along. I hope you found them all to be valuable. And I hope that you are able to use the information that have been imparted in these webinars as part of your graduate school admissions process, if in fact you decide that grad school is a good step for you in your career journey. A little bit about me. I'm again a former admissions director at Washington University in St. Louis. So one of my responsibilities there was recruiting junior military officers. And as part of that, I conducted, and over the course of my career, I've conducted thousands of candidate interviews of one kind or another. And the interview setting is something I'm extremely familiar with and I have a fair amount of expertise in. So I'm happy to impart at least some of that to you this evening. And I also do application coaching around grad school admissions in all areas, not just one or the other, but not just MBA, for example, as this was kind of some of my professional background, but whether that be graduate school in engineering, social work, nursing, you name it, law school, medical school, I'm familiar with it. And so I do coaching around that. And I also do career coaching as well. So career coaching is through Career Roadmap. Grad school admissions coaching is through Grad School Roadmap. And the websites are there if you'd like to check those out. And as Tanya mentioned, my contact information will be at the end of this webinar. And you're welcome to contact me, email me, connect with me on LinkedIn, whatever you might wish to do when it comes to getting in touch with me. So here's our agenda for today. So I'm going to kind of go in chronological order, kind of before, during, and after the admissions interview. Just talk about some of the best practices for each of those phases of the whole experience. And then I'm going to kind of dig deep into sort of some general guidelines for answering questions, and then talk about some of the typical kinds of questions that you will likely encounter in a grad school interview and kind of some best practices for how to go about answering those. So before, during, and after, we'll talk about general guidelines for answering questions, and then talk about some sort of specific questions that you'll likely encounter. So here we go. We're talking before. Okay, the name of the game, ladies and gentlemen, is prepare, prepare, prepare. You can be a fairly average candidate who prepares exceptionally well for an interview, and you go from being just kind of middle of the road to being an outstanding candidate. Prepared candidates are the best candidates. So make sure that you're not just going in and winging it. Make sure you take time to prepare. And it starts after you get that initial interview invitation from the program itself. A lot of times they're going to give you tons of information about, kind of the particulars about, not just when it's going to be, but, the format of it and who you're going to be interviewing with. And if it could be multiple interviews, there's a lot of different things it could be. that they will generally provide for you. But sometimes you actually might have to do a little bit of asking for this sort of thing. You'll have there's be an admissions coordinator, or there'll be, an administrative assistant, or even an assistant director maybe, who's scheduling these things. It just depends on the school. And, it is perfectly acceptable to ask a few clarifying questions about, sort of the format of the interview, and kind of how it's going to go and that sort of thing. But just be careful as you kind of probe for this information, because there comes a point too where you're, you don't want to interview them about your interview. You want to make sure that you're asking appropriate questions, but kind of recognize when we've probably asked enough questions. But generally speaking, they're not trying to be secretive or to give you a curveball kind of interview. And so generally speaking, they are willing to provide this information. Sometimes you just have to ask for it. So things to verify, again, in person, is it video, phone, when is the start time, but also as important is when does it end? And when, in other words, is this a 20-minute interview? Is it 30 minutes, 45, whatever it might be? Find out when the scheduled end time is, because that will be important. And I'll explain why later in the webinar, but you need to know when the scheduled end time of the interview is as well. What information will that interviewer have access to? Many graduate school interviews are what's called blind interviews, which typically means that they only have access to your resume or CV, and that they have not necessarily read your full application. They haven't looked at your letters of recommendation. They haven't read your essays or your statement of purpose. They are not familiar with your undergraduate track record or your standardized test score. And so it's good to know going into that interview what that person is likely familiar with relative to your candidacy. And that could influence some of the responses that you have in the interview itself. Some graduate school admissions interviews are actually also they have like a skills element to them as well, where they'll put you into it. There's like a team exercise, or there'll be some sort of case study or something along these lines. Really good to know that going into it, right? So make sure that you have that information if you can glean that as well. And also, hey, who's going to be interviewing you? If you can find out who that person's going to be, hopefully, if it's a member of the admissions committee, you've already interacted with that person as part of the admissions process leading into the interview, but maybe you haven't. And so take some time to interview that person. To research that person. How do you do that? Be careful with how you. By the way, be careful with how you would bring this up. We're going to talk about ways you can do that, and here are some ways you can do it. LinkedIn, a general Google search. One of my favorites is to see if you can find them on LinkedIn. See if you can find them on YouTube, because when you find them on YouTube, what you do is you have the opportunity to kind of hear them speak and understand sort of some of their mannerisms and sort of their speech styles or patterns, that sort of thing. And it's one less sort of new thing, perhaps, that you have to learn and process when you come into the interview setting itself. So don't overlook YouTube as a place to potentially scope that person out. And if you have someone who's either been through the program recently or maybe a current student, is there anything that person can kind of quietly kind of tell you about that individual relative to their interview style or anything else that might be valuable there? Just when you that information that you're gaining on these interviewers, make sure that if you do bring that up in the context of the interview, that you do it in a careful way, because you want to make sure that, if something comes up, you bring it up in an appropriate way and not a way that makes the interviewer think that you've been basically, looking at everything they've ever posted online and everything. That can come across the wrong way. The right way to maybe bring that up is something along these lines. Maybe when it's your turn to ask questions of the interviewer, you say something along the lines of, hey, I noticed that you yourself are an alum of this program. I wonder maybe if you could, as I was doing my research on LinkedIn, I saw that you were here around 10 years ago. Maybe you could tell me a little bit about how the program has changed from your time as a student here up until now. That's where you kind of acknowledge, hey, as preparation for this interview, I noticed your LinkedIn profile, and then ask a question from there. Again, it's okay to acknowledge that you did some research. Most interviewers like to see that you did research. Just be careful not to just drop in random information that makes them question, okay, how deep did this person dig before the interview? So make sure you scout out your interviewer. In addition to scouting out your interview, of course, know the program as thoroughly as you can. I sure hope you know it pretty well by this stage if you've actually applied there and you've gotten to the interview stage. So, if you can communicate as part of the context of your answers in your interview questions that you really know the program backward and forward, and you're familiar with what's been going on and these sorts of things, you really can come across as really sort of being one of them And that's part of your mission there, is you want to sort of demonstrate as part of the interview, or a part of the interview, that you fit in with their culture, you fit in with that community, that they can, as they're sitting there interviewing you, again, whether that's in person or virtual, whatever it might be, that they could see you in their program, just based upon sort of, again, your interpersonal skills, your communication style, and that sort of thing. And one of the ways you do that is by knowing their program backward and forward. If it's been a while since you've looked at your CV and your resume that you submitted for this particular program, also your personal statement, your essays, that sort of thing, good time to refamiliarize yourself with that, even if it's a blind interview. Because figure this, just think about it. After the interview, the interviewer is probably going to have to, type up some sort of report or file some sort of, information about how the interview went and make a recommendation. That information is going to be looked at probably by pretty much the entire admissions committee, and many of them will have read your full application. And if the information in the interview report doesn't align with what's in the rest of your application, that can cause some friction and possibly work to your detriment when it comes to the admissions decision. So make sure that you refamiliarize yourself with your entire application as part of your preparation. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but make sure you prepare your questions for them, because just like a job interview, there will come that moment at the end of the interview where they'll say, "So Tom, so Susan, tell us about, what questions do you have for us?" So you'll have that opportunity to ask questions. There are good questions and bad questions. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But what's really not good is if you don't have any questions. You always want to have questions, at least one or two. And so make sure that you take some time to prepare several questions for them. As I mentioned, we will talk more about this a little bit later in the webinar. So personal appearance, really important, whether we like it or not. Are you ready with your attire and your personal appearance? Again, we haven't even started the interview yet, but this is the stuff that goes into the preparation part of it. Always better to overdress than to underdress for an interview. So business formal attire, if you don't know for sure, and again, that could be something you gently sort of find out as part of your research before the actual event itself. Unless you know for sure, always overdress rather than underdress. You do not want to be, if it's an in-person interview and it's 3 of them and 1 of you, you don't want to be the only person not wearing, a suit and tie. It's a pretty embarrassing feeling. And you immediately start the interview on less footing than you would if you had dressed the part. So make sure that you are ready for this. If it's been a while since for some of us who haven't been dressing up all that much lately, whether you're working from home, COVID situation, whatever it might be, when's the last time you put on that suit and tie or that business dress outfit, whatever it might be? Hey, does it still fit? Is it clean and pressed? Is it still in line with current styles? All these different things. And it's not just your attire. Hey, haircuts, are you going to need a haircut? Are any accessories, jewelry, etc. Is all that, ready to go? But just make sure that the overarching principle of this whole entire thing, when they see you and your physical appearance, it's basically a check the box kind of thing. You just want to basically look the part, look like you belong in that program, and you want almost all of their focus on what you say, not your personal appearance, not what you're wearing. So it's a quick check the box thing. It's easy to get right. It's also easy to get wrong. So make sure that you pay attention to this, and don't leave it to the night before to think about oh, what am I going to wear for that interview tomorrow? Plan this out. Okay, the kind of interview matters. If it's a video interview, if it's Zoom or Teams or GoToMeeting or FaceTime or whatever it might be, just like so many of us who are living in this online meeting environment, make sure you have an ideal location, reliably quiet place, no distractions, good internet connection, reliable internet connection, minimal to no interruptions during the interview. If it happens, it happens, but you want to try to minimize that as much as you can. Test all your technology. Don't wait until game day to test out. I mean, I had this happen to a gentleman. It goes back a while now, but he had to do an interview via Teams, and he waited to the last minute. He didn't have Teams on his computer. Microsoft Teams we're talking about here. He didn't have it on his computer. So he downloaded it like at the last minute. There were all kinds of hiccups, and he was like 10 or 15 minutes late to the interview simply because he hadn't done that in advance. Don't do that. Everything in advance. Be ready, be prepared. Good lighting and sound. Professional dress from head to toe gets back to that attire thing. This is kind of a psychological thing, and I think it partially depends on person to person. But the trick is that if you are, in other words, don't If you've got a coat and tie and all this up top, don't wear like shorts and flip-flop down low because psychologically there are people who say that your brain won't sort of fully be in professional mode if you're not dressed professionally from head to toe. I think that that's kind of a personal thing, but I do know that for many people that actually works. And so I wouldn't cut corners on that. Go professional from head to toe. Have some cheat sheets in front of you. You'd always want to have definitely a copy of your resume in front of you or your CV, and your essays in front of you. Essays less important than your resume or CV. Resume or CV important because this is a prelude to some of our other stuff down the road when we talk about kinds of questions. Very common question could be walk me through your resume, walk me through your CV. And if you don't have your resume or CV handy, I hope you know it pretty well because it's a lot harder to do when you don't have it right in front of you there. Maybe you have a cheat sheet with some basic high level bullet points of some key points you want to make or something like that. But even especially in a video interview, it's all about positive eye contact with your camera. It's not about looking down at your cheat sheets. We never want to read responses to an answer, and we never want to appear to be over relying on our cheat sheet. It's there kind of as an emergency crutch. If you need something to quickly jog your memory, it's right there, and you can glance at it. Just be very careful about over relying on that cheat sheet, because one of the things we want to do in the process of the admissions interview is come across as conversational, genuine, likable, and we're just two people or three people, whatever it is, having a conversation, not someone reading responses to prompts that they had anticipated. Go out of your way to smile while speaking. It definitely makes a difference. Just overall smiling. It's funny because I think a lot of times people think that, it's a graduate admissions interview. It's all buttoned up and I have to be serious about this and everything. As I say many, many times, these admissions committees, these programs are looking to bring in human beings and admit human beings. They're not looking for robots. And they usually want people who are warm, approachable, friendly, this sort of thing. And smiles go a long way toward that. Yes, it's a serious endeavor and treat it as such, but smiles can go a long way. So never underestimate their power. Okay, some other things to kind of keep in mind, just generally talking about interviews for this whole thing. There's no one single right way to be successful in an interview, just as similarly, there is no one way to conduct an admissions interview. And so while it is possible to predict many of the things that go into admissions interviews, just because there are a lot of common things here, it's impossible. It would be impossible for me or anyone else to predict everything that could possibly happen or everything that could be asked in an admissions interview. So yes, preparation is absolutely essential. Again, I would never encourage anyone to just, go in and wing it or to study for 10 minutes beforehand and think they're going to do well. But you have to, yes, be prepared, but also be ready to think on your feet. You have to be adaptable and you have to be ready for the unexpected. And when it happens, just thinking on your feet, clear your mind and think about it for a second and then move forward with it. Because it almost is certainly the case that the majority of what you'll experience in the admissions interview, you will have predicted. But a lot of times there's that element of unpredictability. You got to be ready for that. You got to be ready to think on your feet. Okay, so just before the admissions interview, so I'm under this impression here, or the assumption here rather, is that it's something in person. And by the way, admissions interviews, yes, a lot of them are still virtual. That hasn't changed all that much, but there are some that are going more to in-person formats. Obviously, COVID has a lot to do with that, but you're going to be ready for either one because your invitation to interview could be an on-campus interview. Or it could be virtual, it just depends, but it could happen either way. If it's in person, you get to the building, you get to where your interview is going to be, duck into a restroom, make sure everything's still looking good and in order and all that kind of good stuff. Remember that if you're on campus or wherever this admissions interview is, if you're meeting the person at a coffee shop or at the lobby of a hotel or whatever it is, or at the on-campus building where the program is headquartered, remember that you are being evaluated at all times. You never know who knows whom and who can report back to you, to someone influential on the admissions committee. Obviously, there's never a reason not to be polite, professional, and courteous and all that sort of stuff. But there are all kinds of stories that are legendary in admissions circles about the perfect candidate when he or she was in front of the admissions committee members, but treated other people on campus in a less than ideal manner. and word got back to the admissions committee and that person was denied. There are, like I said, legendary stories about this. Don't be that person. Just remember that you are always being evaluated whenever you're on site. Okay, I get this question a lot, Kevin. Hey, when do I show up? When do I get there? Well, my suggestion is this, and that is that whether it's an in-person interview or a virtual interview, 5 minutes beforehand, exactly 5, not earlier. Why not earlier? Because if you're there earlier, especially if it's in person, the person in the lobby will let the person know, hey, so-and-so is here for their admissions interview. And if it's 10 minutes or 15 minutes, oftentimes that person can feel pressured now that they somehow have to accommodate you because you were there early. I know many of us are in the habit of showing up to things early, and I think overall that's probably a pretty positive quality. There is a such thing in the admissions interview as showing up too early. That's why I would recommend literally 5 minutes. So, if it's in person, you might be in the building where it's going to be 10 or 15 minutes beforehand. That's fine. But it's in, suite 201 or whatever, that's where you're going to walk in and, sort of introduce yourself and say, I'm here for the admissions interview. You walk into that 5 minutes early. Same if it's an online interview, if it's on Zoom or something like that, as I'm sure you've all experienced when it comes to these things. If you're hosting such a thing and someone is in the meeting room early or is there super early, the person will get an email or a text. They'll get a notification saying, hey, so-and-so is in your meeting room, assuming that's how they set it up in Zoom or whatever. And once again, the same thing can happen there. Now, all of a sudden they feel obligated, like, hey, they're waiting for me. 5 minutes. That's what you need to know. 5 minutes. In person, don't be empty-handed. Have something, if nothing else, a file folder, a professional portfolio case. This is not the time to have your gym backpack slung over your shoulder or something like this. Something minimal, something professional, something where you can take some notes, maybe have some extra copies of your resume, something small, unobtrusive, and professional. And turn off your phone. A lot of times these admissions interviews are conducted in a person's office, which is on the small side, or in a small conference room, something like that. But no matter where it's conducted, if you're in the admissions interview and all of a sudden the big sports news develops, something like this happens, and all of a sudden your buddies are blowing up your text because of something that happens, and your phone just keeps buzzing, that is a distraction. You don't want it. Turn your phone off, completely off. So now we've got the admissions. So finally we're transitioning. Okay, the minute it's going to start, here we go. They come out to the lobby or they come into the Zoom room. It's a strong first impression, first and last name. This surprises me, always surprised me when I was an admissions director, how many times I'd come out to the lobby to bring someone back for an admissions interview, and I'd get, hey, a handshake, good handshake, but just a first name. It's a professional setting, first and last name. Hi, I'm Kevin Carley. How are you? It's a pleasure to meet you. Thanks for the opportunity here today. Really appreciate that. Confident eye contact, smile again, firm but not too firm handshake. No matter who you are or who you're shaking hands with, want a good firm handshake, but we're not trying to break anyone's hand here. So a good firm handshake, but not too firm. Make sure you hit that happy medium. Thank them. Be gracious for their time. Say how much you've been looking forward to it, all that sort of thing. Remember that you never get that second chance to make a first impression. Preliminary small talk, when you're walking back to the conference room, or even when you first sit down, there might be, some discussion about, the weather, or, last night's, basketball game, or, something else that's going on out there. Just be ready for that, and just know that having that go well and being able to navigate that small talk, even though it in theory has nothing to do with the interview itself, actually can set the table and help start that rapport building process, helping you to set the table for a really strong interview. So just be ready for it. Now, you're coming into their environment, you are interviewing with them, not the other way around. And so sort of follow their lead on that, as far as like small talk and whatever, and just, go with it. If you feel like you have to bring something up, you can, but again, let them sort of drive that process, and just know that if you can do well here, you can really set the table for a strong interview. Okay, so we'll talk more, like I said, a little later in the webinar here this evening, to talking about interview questions, how to best respond. And speaking of questions, by the way, I hope you're using the Q&A function. Tanya is going to help us navigate questions at the end of this webinar. I'm going to make sure to leave some time for those. So as questions might come up, please be sure to plug those into the Q&A box, and we'll get to those at the end of the webinar. But like I said, we'll talk more a little bit later about some of the how to respond to questions and some of the common kinds of questions that you could experience in a graduate interview. So we'll get to that. More to come on that. But at the end of your interview, you've been through, they've asked a bunch of questions of you and everything. You get to that moment where it's like, so what questions do you have for me? As I mentioned earlier, you should always have questions for them. Always do that. So when you get to this point, the first thing is you have to think about, okay, how much time do we have left? This is why I mentioned earlier, it's important to know not just the start time, but the end time. So when you have to have a sense at this point about how long you've been in there and how much time you have left. This can be a little tricky because what you don't want to do, well, your phone is off, so you're not going to pull your phone out and look. Maybe there's a clock over that person's shoulder, something like that. I would not recommend looking at your watch. Not a good idea. You just have to have a sense of kind of how much time you have left. Usually these interviews, you get in there and they seem to just fly by. That's what most people tell me, and I would corroborate that. But depending on how much time you have left could influence how many questions you have. Generally speaking, would never recommend asking more than 3. Usually 1 or 2 are okay. And even if you are tight on time, if they ask you, what questions do you have for me? Usually 1 or 2 are okay. The point here is you don't want to be that person who they say, so what questions do you have for me? And you have literally 25 questions that you all want to get through. You have to understand that there's a time limit for these interviews, and just know that, it's okay if you don't get all your questions answered right there, especially if you move along in the admissions process. You will have an opportunity to get all your questions answered, I assure you. So just be careful about being that person who asks too many questions. But you always want to make sure that you have questions prepared, because asking good questions helps demonstrate genuine interest. And by the way, that is also part of how you'll be evaluated. Asking good questions can reflect really positively on you in the interview. So again, even if you thought if for some reason you go through the interview and you thought it was just sort of mediocre, you're like, it didn't go real well, I didn't really build good rapport. If you have good questions, that by itself can actually be a plus in the whole process, because again, it demonstrates sound interest, and it makes it come across more that you are really and genuinely want to go there. Good questions are the ones you want to ask. What is not a good question, as mentioned here on this slide? A not good question is one that can be readily answered by a 5-minute sweep of the program website. Show that you've done your research. Ask questions that are not readily available in any of their other materials. And by materials, by the way, that would include social media. And so a lot of these programs go to a lot of effort to put things out there on Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, whatever it might be. If you're, by the way, as a quick thing, if you're seriously considering programs as part of your way of sort of plugging into them, you need to be, following them on social media, like all of it. And that's a great way to plug in. It's a great way to make sure that you're on the up and up on what's going on in those programs. So anyway, just make sure that you're asking good questions. And by the way, you don't have to wait to the end of the interview to ask those questions. It could be the case that contextually, or, a topic comes up and, hey, this is a good opportunity to ask one of my questions. And so you could say something along the lines of, hey, while I'm on this topic, do you mind if I ask you something? Just make sure that you understand that overall in this interview process, this is the interviewer's process. This is their interview. Let them take the interview where it needs to go. So in other words, I wouldn't just ask a question. I would sort of say, hey, while we're on this topic, do you mind if I ask a question about this? Because there are graduate school admissions interviews out there that are extremely structured, and they have a set list of questions that they basically have to ask as part of, like, they have a boss somewhere who's saying you have to get through these 7 questions or 10 questions or whatever it is. And you asking a question actually messes up their flow. And so never just assume you can do that. And if they say, well, I have to get through these questions, but maybe we'll come back to it later. Hey, no problem. You'll get to it at the end, no problem. But it actually can help you turn the interview into a more conversational sort of thing. Big thing about, I'm going into some detail on this because, again, this is usually one of the last things that happens in the admissions interview, kind of as their lasting impression. And again, asking good questions and handling your questions in a really sound and professional way can make a difference. So moving on, make sure that, this goes without saying, some people, but it is some people need this reminder. Make sure that you actually listen to the responses, maybe ask a follow-up question, acknowledge what they're saying. Don't be in such a rush when you ask your first question and they start talking. Don't immediately check out mentally and go to your second question. You're just waiting for them to finish, and then you ask the second question. That's not the way to handle it. You want to make sure that you acknowledge what they've said. Maybe they shared something really important about the process or about the program or something like that. Demonstrate good listening skills, active listening skills. Ask that follow-up question, at least acknowledge what they say. And then if you want to, or you have time, it's whatever, then you move on to the next question. That's the kind of way to handle that one. And again, just because one reason it's important to have many, many questions ready to go for the end is because it's possible in the context of the interview, because you've been in there for 20 minutes or 30 minutes or whatever it is, some of your questions could have been answered in the context of the interview up until then. And then what you don't want to do again is be stuck there at the end and not have any questions. So prepare several. So it's all over. It's kind of the same thing from the beginning, but in reverse order. Thank them graciously, strong final impression, good firm handshake, good eye contact, smile, the whole thing. Remember that you are being evaluated until you are completely off the premises. So pillar of professionalism, courteous, friendly, the whole thing, until you have actually, 100% out of there online for video interviews. That means until 100% sure that you are offline, your webcam is off, your audio is off, the whole thing. I'm starting to hear stories from I still know many people who are still at schools and work in admissions. And I'm hearing stories now about how people thought that they were offline at the end of the interview and they were not. And they said something, or they dropped their professionalism too early, and it was caught on a live microphone, so to speak. So make sure that you're completely offline before you say something you might regret. And so finally, what I would recommend is you just sort of do a brain dump after the interview is over, and kind of write down notes, anything that you learned, that sort of thing. Could come in handy later on, could come in handy for thank you notes. Let's talk about that. If you want to send those as soon as reasonably possible to everyone you interviewed with. There is no need the minute you get off campus to pull your car over to the nearest parking lot and type in a thank you email on your iPhone and send it right away. That's excessive. But within 24 hours, generally speaking, you want to send that thank you. Email is perfectly fine. Handwritten notes are okay. But especially these days when so many individuals, including on college campuses, aren't in their offices as much as they used to, they're working from home, email is even more so the way to go. What you don't want to do is only send a handwritten note. And then again, because they're not in their office, but once every other week or whatever, they don't get it until very late, and possibly until after the admissions committee has already met and decided. So within 24 hours is generally going to be a pretty good benchmark on that. The good news on thank you emails is they don't need to be anything long, extravagant, flowery, or anything like that. Get in and get out, short and sweet. Hey, thank you so much for your time. Highlight maybe one or two things, three things, whatever, that you really, that resonated for you, or that you're going to remember from it. Thank them again. Say, I'm looking forward to the admissions committee's decision, and sincerely, and get out. They don't have to be this big, long thing. Shorter is definitely better when it comes to these things. Okay, so we're moving right along here. So just kind of a little bit of a roadmap of where we are. We've talked about before, during, and after the admissions interview. Now we're going to talk about some general guidelines for answering questions, and then we're going to get to types of interview questions and how to respond to that. So that's where we're 3/5 of the agenda here today. Okay, so answering questions, some general guidelines. So the length of your responses, in most cases, no more than 2 minutes. You really don't need to go much longer than that, even for the most detailed of questions. It could be less for some questions, for sure, but just make sure that overall your answers aren't too brief. What we don't want to do is to make that interview feel like they're having to extract information out of you. Your goal is, again, to establish rapport and make this interview more of a give and take, and more of a conversation sort of thing. And by the way, you can always include specific examples as part of your responses. We're going to talk about behavioral questions in a little bit here, which are specifically, they want to know examples of your experiences. But you don't have to wait for a behavioral question to provide an example that illustrates something that they asked about. So you don't have to, obviously, but just understand that you don't have to wait until they prompt you to ask for an example for you to provide an example. Remember that a story well told is memorable. And so, if you provide a good example that is relevant to what they asked about, that helps make your response and you more memorable. And that is a good thing. Another thing about answering questions, this gets back to some of the things we talked about in some of the earlier webinars when it comes to, I hesitate to use the term self-promotion, but selling yourself, however you want to term that. So this is similar to a job situation. You are in graduate admissions, you have competition. You probably don't know who almost all of them are, but you're certainly not the only applicant for this program. You are competing against other people, and it's a competitive process. And you can just assume that those other individuals are doing the best that they can to communicate to the admissions committee their achievements, their accomplishments, why they're a good fit for that program, and so on. And if you don't proactively do that, you could be seen in a lesser light by the admissions committee. Again, it's the same thing that happens in a job search oftentimes, and it happens in graduate admissions too. You have to get comfortable communicating your accomplishments, your achievements. The admissions committees, just like hiring managers in the corporate world, understand that you're not some egomaniac who's in the habit of constantly puffing up their accomplishments and telling everyone about how wonderful they are. This is one of those settings where that sort of communication is appropriate. And in fact, I would submit to you that it's necessary as part of you earning an offer of admissions from the program. So again, what if you don't and your competition does? You got to get comfortable with it. And by the way, it's not just about what you say, it's how you say it. Your answers are underscored by your nonverbals, your body language, strong eye contact. We talked about this. Smile. Hand gestures within reason. You don't want to be, looking like, you're, working to, land a helicopter on the pad here. Some hand gestures are okay, but, there's research that shows that when you see people's hands more often when they're speaking, they come across as more trustworthy. I don't know if that's universal or not, but the point is that if you never see, this is a video interview, and if my hands are always down here and you never see them, I think it makes that individual come across a little less sort of real, a little less human. And so again, hand gestures, again, we're trying to be human beings here. Sit up straight, hold still, no fidgeting. This can be very challenging in the admissions interview setting, because a lot of times people are kind of amped up. The heart's going a little bit. They want to make a positive impression, and they tend to fidget. And this is something I can promise you that I sometimes do when I'm interviewing. It's something I always have to work on, because even like a slight sort of moving in the chair can be distracting in an interview setting. So just remember that your nonverbals matter. It's not just what you say; it's how you say it and how you're coming across. Okay, so this is the last part of our webinar here today. Before we get into our Q&A, we're going to talk about some specific kinds of interview questions. And we're going to start with the most common interview question of all. And that is, tell me about yourself. Usually it's the very first question asked. When you get this question, you should be extremely happy, because it's so predictable, and you should know that this thing is coming. And when you get the question, the challenge should be not actually responding to it. It should be responding to it in a way that doesn't sound rehearsed, that sounds natural. You need to know this backward and forward, because just like so many other things, it can really set the tone for a really strong interview if you really nail this question. It is the case that most interviewers, whether they're aware of it or not, will make a determination about you fairly early in the interview. That's just the way it is. And again, that's why those first few moments in the interview are just so important. And if you get this question as your first real interview question after the small talk, which of course you've done well at, this is a gift. I mean, take this and run with it. And as part of my coaching, I work with many people about how to effectively answer this question. Just like most questions, there's no need to go more than 2 minutes. So 1 or 2 minutes of your sort of, people call it your elevator speech, your infomercial about yourself. Super important question. And this is something that you want to make sure that you anticipate. There's a number of different sort of templates you can use to answer this question, by the way. Again, something that I work on with people who I coach when they get to this phase of the admissions process. So here's a sample of some common interview questions. In no way meant to be comprehensive. In no way meant to be an exhaustive list. These are just some of them that are here. Again, remember, as we said earlier, we can prepare as much as we possibly can, but it's impossible to anticipate every possible question they could ask. So we have to be ready to think on our feet. I would tell you that the first 4 ones listed here on this slide, on the left-hand side, what do you know about our program? Why did you apply here? Why should we admit you? And what are your short and long-term career goals? Those are extremely common. These other ones are common. Those first 4 are very common. And you definitely want to know your responses to those particular questions and be ready for those, because very, very good chance that you will be asked those particular ones. But, you might get some other ones too. You might get the classic, what are your strengths and weaknesses? And again, program, they can ask you pretty much anything. And sometimes these questions are it's these questions, but asked slightly different way. Why did you apply here? Is the same way of saying, why do you want to come to this program? Which is different than what do you know about our program? And so sometimes it's worded slightly different. But these are the common questions that you should be very ready. In addition to, so tell us about yourself, which is first cousin to, by the way, walk us through your resume. These first 4 that are on here, definitely want to be ready for those. Finally, we're going to talk about behavioral event interview questions. These are ones that people tend to really struggle with. And by struggle with, I mean to sort of get to a point where they are comfortable with them. Once you have sort of a model for how to effectively answer these kinds of questions, I've seen it hundreds of times. It becomes much, much easier to do that. And I'm going to give you that model in just a moment here. A behavioral question. You're getting one of these when the interviewer starts out his or her question with, tell me about a time when you, or can you give me an example of an instance where you, can you give me, that's a behavioral question. They want to know about a specific instance from your past where you faced some sort of issue or challenge or scenario, and what you specifically did in that instance. That is a behavioral question. You might see some of these, by the way, as part of application essays, but much more often, you'll see them as part of the interview. So, and again, the thought is that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. So again, they want to know specifically how you responded to certain situations. What they want to do, you're really being asked here is to tell a story about something, an experience that you've had. And as I mentioned earlier, a story well told is memorable. This can be a difference maker. So as part of your preparation for behavioral questions, you need to have about 10 or 15 examples from your experience at the ready. And there's a whole process. Again, I work with people I coach on kind of going back through this and identifying good examples that they can use. You have to kind of go back and do an inventory of some of your past experiences and decide, okay, here's some stories, or here's some instances, here are some examples that I could use for behavioral questions in interviews. And just identifying what it was or what story you might use is frankly just the first step. And by the way, those examples from military service can definitely be used as part of the responses to behavioral questions. Just keep in mind throughout the entire interview, not just with behavioral things, that the person sitting across the table from you or the person who you work on with Zoom with may not have a service background. And it could be the case that you may have to sort of explain certain terms or explain certain situations or scenarios in a way to someone who isn't familiar or someone who doesn't have that kind of background. So here are some sample behavioral questions. Tell me what, I'm going in the upper right-hand corner here. Tell me about a conflict you had with a coworker. What happened there? Tell us about a major accomplishment and how you achieved it. Tell us about the most successful team you've been a part of. How did you contribute to its success? Once again, these are just some examples here, 8 different potential ones, not meant to be an exhaustive list at all. And so the opportunity here is to, again, provide an example, a specific situation where you went through something, you experienced something, and how it turned out for you, how it came away from you. Again, got to be ready to think on your feet. So what's the technique for doing this? How do you go about approaching these behavioral questions? It's a technique called the STAR technique. And this is something that every MBA program, I assure you, has heard of. Every graduate business program, every graduate engineering program, every graduate program, I think, on the entire planet is familiar with the STAR approach. It's very common. And the reason is it works. Okay, so what it does is it helps sort of take this sort of scenario or this example that you have and sort of distill it down so that you can respond to a question like this, again, in 2 minutes, less than 2 minutes. And so that someone who is from the outside coming in can sort of enter that scenario and get a contextual understanding of what was going on, and understand what your role was in this entire thing. So the S is the situation. You set the context for what was happening, very high level sort of thing. You just enough context so they get the general idea. The T is the task. What needed to be accomplished? What this is a sentence or two. What were you charged with doing? What was your responsibility? What action? What the action is the next one. What task did you actually, what were you responsible for? What did you have to do? So the action is, what action did you actually take relative to the situation and what you were tasked with doing? This is the majority of your answer. The action. What did you specifically do? This is what the interviewer and this is what the program is most interested in knowing. What action did you take? What did you do to make that team successful, or to resolve that conflict, or to save the day, or whatever it is that they're looking for in that particular question? The action. What action did you take? Finally, the result. What was the positive outcome that you helped create or you helped drive through your actions? This is an easy thing to leave off because so many people get very fixated on the action part of their response. But you want to make sure that you always say, okay, and the result was, this was the outcome that we had. And you definitely want to make sure that your result, as much as you possibly can, is a positive result. This is a good reason, again, that's important to prepare these things beforehand and make sure that you do have, even a negative situation, the positive result is what you learned from the situation, or, how it helped you grow as a professional or as an officer or whatever it might be. I'll give you 3 common pitfalls on behavioral questions, and then we're going to transition to the Q&A, and I'm looking forward to those questions. This is the kind of thing that I see very regularly as I help coach people through behavioral questions. When they're asked for a specific situation, tell us about a time when you whatever, they're looking for a specific example. And so if, for example, if the situation was, tell us about the most success, if the question was, tell us about the most successful team you've ever been a part of. What was your role in making it successful? What you don't want to do is respond something along the lines of, oh yes, I've been very lucky to be on part of many successful teams, and I've been very lucky in that regard, and I've always been surrounded by really good people. And generally speaking, in these teams, I kind of like to see, sort of where the strengths are in the overall team, and sort of fill in where there might be a little bit of a weakness to sort of round out the overall strengths of the overall team. And I think that's one of the things that I do best. I really adapt well to the overall team and sort of help complement the overall skills within the group. That's not a bad answer necessarily, but all that is good. But the challenge is that they didn't ask for general things. They didn't ask how you generally fit in on successful teams. They want to know a specific example of a team that you were on and what you specifically contributed to make it successful, not a general thing. Okay. So they want to see you in action in a very specific example. So no generalities. They're asking for a specific example. Make sure you provide that to them. Too much time talking about the situation, being bogged down in details. Generally speaking, the interviewer doesn't need to know intricate details about the overall situation. Just give them some high level context. You focus on the action, also on the result. If for some reason they need some clarification around this, they will ask a clarifying question, but just give them just enough information so that they have a broad idea of kind of what was going on here. Keep the focus on the action that you took. Finally, not providing specifics during the result. A result is a poor result statement is part of this framework is, oh, it turned out okay. No, you want to specifically to say what the outcome was. And again, ideally, it's a positive outcome. Even for a negative situation, try to come up with a positive sort of, okay, yeah, this project didn't go well, but what I learned going forward, and I've enacted in my future projects up until now, is that I always make sure that everyone on my team is very clear on what the expectations are. Because again, you make it a positive, but again, make sure that you provide specifics during that result, and make sure you don't leave the result off. Because again, that's another thing that I've seen people get so into talking about what action they took, they forget to say what the outcome was. What was the result of the overall thing? So that's a little bit about behavioral questions. So overall in an interview, yeah, you're going to probably see what I call common interview questions. These things, that tell me about yourself and why did you apply to our program, and short-term and long-term career goals and that sort of thing. Behavioral questions are definitely a common feature in graduate school application interviews, admissions interviews. And so you want to make sure that you have specific things at the ready for these things. That wraps up the formal part of our presentation. Looks like we have about 10 minutes left. Thank you so much for your kind attention. I truly appreciate it. And I do hope that you're going to be joining us again in a week, both to hear about funding for grad school, which is the final live webinar, which leads right into the live virtual admissions fair featuring the university representatives. That is going to be a great opportunity to meet admissions reps from a lot of really good programs. And I hope that you'll join the good people at SAC. Tanya has done amazing work at this, and it's going to be a great event in a week. So without any further ado, I'll hand it back over to Tanya, and we'll see what kinds of questions we have in the Q&A. Tanya?
Sure. Thanks, Kevin. This is great information. Michael has asked a couple of questions. So for the walk me through your resume question, is it appropriate to ask if they'd like a brief overview or a detailed overview, or is there always a happy medium that fits any scenario?
It's more the latter. I would not ask that question. I would, again, you're aiming for, 2-ish minutes. And by 2-ish minutes, I should say no more than 2 minutes, somewhere 90 seconds to 2 minutes. This is a question that you should anticipate, and again, one that you should practice and work. And you should never be answering that question for the very first time in the interview setting itself. Practice how you would answer that question and do it in a way that works best for you. Keep it under 2 minutes. That is the appropriate response, because you don't want to go into details, because a great amount of detail. Because they have the whole interview to ask you additional details about those sorts of things. And if there's a part of your resume that for whatever reason is more attractive or interesting or compelling, or they want to probe further, they will. So again, whatever, if 90 seconds or 2 minutes is very high level, then okay, high level. If that's very detailed, then but it's a great question, but no, I would not ask that. Give them a 90-second to 2-minute summary of your resume, and then they will ask further details if they are interested in learning more.
Great. And we have one more question, but if anyone else has questions, please go ahead and get those typed into the Q&A. But our second question is it appropriate to take notes during the interview on things or insights the interviewer is providing? Great
question. Great. Is that Michael as well?
It is.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael. That's a phenomenal question. So asking about taking notes, that is something, it gets back to this whole principle of it's their room, it's their interview, and they're running the show. And yes, you want to make sure that you're being proactive and you're being assertive and confident and everything. I would not just assume that you can take notes, especially if it's an in-person interview. Like I said, I know a lot of people who are who are currently admissions deans, admissions directors. Some of them downright do not like that. They feel that it sort of pulls away from your attention to the whole thing. So here's what I would suggest. If you get to an in-person interview, you might, again, there's a whole, we didn't get into many details tonight, but, for example, if you're in a conference room, okay, that's different than if you're in that person's personal office. If you're in a conference room, it's common space, basically. It is perfectly acceptable to put things on that table in front of you. Maybe if you have a portfolio, open it up, something like that. You have some things in front of you. And maybe you do have a blank notepad right there, kind of at the ready. So it's perfectly acceptable to kind of use that space. Let's say if you're in someone's private office, and you have their desk in between, and you're at their desk. I would never assume that you can just put your stuff on their desk. I would never do that. They may say, oh, let me make a little room for you. So you can, okay, fine, do that. But be very mindful. You are in their office, and that is their personal space. I'd be very careful about that. If you're in their office at like a side table, yeah, you could probably do that. Again, having that in front of you, because, yes, if you're in their office at their desk, maybe you kind of balance it up. You have your file folder or your portfolio or whatever it is, kind of leaning against your chair or something like that. Again, unless you're invited to use that space, because again, you want to have your resume in front of you, because if you tell me about, walk me through your resume or whatever, you want to be able to do that. But getting to your question though, if you feel that you really want to take notes, the way you handle that is when as part of sort of that initial thing, you ask, do you mind if I take some notes? It's just that simple. And be prepared for them to say no. And if they do, no problem, just move on. I would not encourage it. In fact, if you really feel like you need to take notes, then ask. I would encourage you to trust your short-term memory. And again, that's the reason why you do that information dump at the end of it. I would encourage you to spend that time, instead of taking notes, again, practicing active listening skills, really plugging in with your eye contact. That's the way that you, more generally than not, are going to sort of impress with your level of engagement in the interview, rather than taking notes. Now, yes, if there's a quick note that you have to take, there's a key date that they give you or something like that. Oh, October 10th. Yeah, October, write it down real quick and move on, but don't, taking notes can be really distracting, and I would be very cautious about doing it. But I love that question, Michael. Thank you for asking that. That's awesome. I'm so happy that you asked that question.
We have another question here. Since most, if not all of the folks participating in this event are military and will be using some sort of military assistance, if you haven't been able to find out answers to your veteran support questions during your research of the school, is it appropriate to ask a question or two related to that in your interview?
Yes, it is appropriate to ask that. I would make sure that just like in your admissions interview, your essays, and just like in your responses to overall interview questions, never assume that you are going to be admitted. and so you're, a PhD from Duke University would allow me to, not will allow me to. You're speaking in the conditional. You haven't been admitted yet. And so it's really important that, when you address financial aid questions are perfectly acceptable. That's fine. Understand that some admissions officers may or may not be as familiar, but those are fair questions, and be forgiving if perhaps they have to sort of defer if they don't know. But just like with all of your communication through this process in the admissions area, it's, if I were to be accepted here, or if I were to matriculate here, how would the financial aid process work for, always be sure that you're not assuming. I've seen overly confident people inadvertently start to communicate as if they've already been admitted during the admissions interview, which is not the case. So good question. That's good.
All right. Well, yeah. I think that is it for the questions this evening. Thank you again, Kevin, for a great presentation. Thanks again to all of the folks who attended this evening. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Kevin or to me. And I know all of you have gotten Melissa's email, so you've got her contact information as well. And we look forward to seeing you next Wednesday at the Advanced Education Fair, starting with the webinar at 6 p.m. Thank you again. Have a great night, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, everyone.
All right.
Thanks,
bye-bye.
Tanya.